All right, hello and welcome everybody. It is time for Chapter 10 of Murray Rothbard's America's Great Depression Study Guide, or summary, or whatever you want to call it. It's kind of a study guide because I'm kind of going through and... Anyway, so we joked about the chapter title from the last chapter, where the chapter title is just 1930. This time we got a slightly better chapter title. The chapter title for Chapter 10 is 1931, The Tragic Year. Now, unfortunately, what we learned in the first paragraph is that this isn't one of Rothbard's eloquent ideas. This is actually a quote from Benjamin Anderson's book, Economics and the Public Welfare, which we've seen cited many, many times throughout this book. Basically, 1931 is where everything started to fall over again after massive, massive federal efforts to paper over the effects that were culminating in the Great Depression. 1931 starts out with, or at least throughout 1931, what helped push the Depression along, what helped precipitate it in the U.S. was actually an economic crisis in Europe. One of the largest Austrian banks, basically people lost all confidence in it because it started, it is the crumbling Boden Credit Anstalt, which merged with the older and stronger Österreichische Credit Anstalt, and they got some new capital, but unfortunately, it just wasn't enough. What ended up happening was that France decided to call all of their Austrian debts, thereby throwing the Austrian banks into even more turmoil. And basically what ended up happening was that Europe went completely off the gold standard, including England. Now, this is one of those lovely little historical tidbits that Rothbard loves to bite into. But Rothbard notes that England went off the gold standard without really any real fight on September 20th. And this was 2 days after they assured Dr. Vissering, head of the Netherlands Bank, that they were going to stay on the gold standard. And in fact, Rothbard notes that they probably warned the U.S. in advance as well, because there were secret visits from the English bank officials to the U.S. and Canada around that time under like pseudonyms and stuff for supposedly medical stuff. Yeah, so this was pretty dirty. But basically, what ended up happening was that the U.S. had all these loans out to these European banks, assurances and stuff like that, and they were left holding the bag. So the first, subheading, the first main section of this chapter is called The American Monetary Picture. And Rothbard notes that at this time, production was falling and unemployment was rising. They had tried to keep unemployment down and failed. They had tried to keep production up and failed. Producers' goods were being hit with this crazy drop in usefulness, way worse than consumers' goods. For instance, pig iron dropped nearly 80% from 1929 in June to December of 1931, just barely a little over 2 years. Whereas retail department store sales only dropped by about 25% over the same time frame. Now, it's hard to find a more perfect example of a capital good, of a producer's good, than pig iron. Nobody actually hangs on to pig iron in any form for any reason in their homes for pure consumption. So pretty representative, and retail department store sales again are pretty representative of consumers' goods. Recall that this specific effect, that producers' goods fail way more than consumers' goods, is directly predicted by the Austrian business cycle theory, and so this is exactly what Rothbard was saying was going to happen. And unfortunately, here it goes. The efforts to paper over the mistakes, the malinvestments, has worn out. So at that point, there's more inflation in controlled reserves. The Federal Reserve is throwing out cash as fast as it can in all the ways that it can do so. Unfortunately, these are outpaced by uncontrolled contraction. There was a lot of money that left reserves and went into circulation. People were starting to lose trust in the banks. We're going to see, if you know anything about the Great Depression, you'll know that there were a bunch of bank runs. And so far, the bank runs had been, Rothbard hasn't talked about them, so they're not like a huge deal yet, but they will become important later on. Trust in banks is falling. And another thing that happened was that the gold reserves, the federal gold reserves, peaked in this time period and started to decrease rather rapidly. At this point, the Fed decides to do more of the same. They lower their rediscount rates. They are criticized for tight policy, nevertheless, because because you don't expect a cocaine addict to say, "Well, you're not giving me enough, well, you're giving me too much cocaine." Anyway, next section, the fiscal burden of government. Now, it's worth noting that gross national product and gross private product were both falling at this point. However, the government outlays were growing. There are numbers in the book that are worth at least kind of mentioning, because there's something worth. Federal expenditures rose from $4.2 billion in 1930 to $5.5 billion in 1931. You notice how crazy small these numbers are compared to what we're dealing with today? Part of the effect of centrally planned banking and government control of the money system. What the government basically did was a bunch of transfer payments. Most of that was loans to veterans, but there was also a bunch of grants to state and local governments. So it was like the federal government pays lesser governments, which then pay out their own people. It's, a shell game, but, it's what they were doing. Let's see. Next section. Public works and wage rates. So you may recall that Emergency Committee for Employment, the one with the propaganda guy, Bernays, they were recommending more public works. A term comes up in the book here, and it was used at the time, called enlightened self-interest, which what that really means is, hey, businesses, do stupid things and wait for a bailout. It doesn't work out very well, generally speaking, and that's what we're seeing happening right here. There was a bidding war for public works allocations. On page 265, it's pretty funny. Senator Wagner suggests $2 billion in public works. Senator LaFollette says, $5.5 billion. And these numbers just go up and up and up for no really compelling reason. What ended up happening was that there was William Randolph Hearst recommended $5 billion, and yeah, the government just went nuts with public works again. Not particularly helpful for anybody but the people on the dole of the federal government. At the same time that everybody was worried about production dropping, Hoover decided to stop leasing federal lands to logging companies for forestry. And so, of course, that hurt those companies in an already precarious state. He called a bunch more committees and conferences. Of course, the experts, generally speaking, when they came in, they justified more state power, more state spending, more of the same thing that is causing all the problems that they're dealing with. There were a lot of state-based efforts to do a lot of, say, public works. Rothbard notes in particular that the biggest culprits here were California, Pennsylvania, Maryland, Massachusetts, and Michigan. He especially notes that Michigan was doing highway construction during the winter. And so it is in fact true that Michigan highways are a boondoggle for the last 100 years, uninterrupted. So good to know. It's important to note that there was a pressure to, I'm going to quote this from the book, wherever practical and whenever the cost is substantially the same, weasel words, work should be performed by hand rather than by machines in order to provide for the employment of a greater number of persons. Now, this is the employment fallacy, right? Capital goods make people more productive. That's the purpose of them. And, it's the case where there's that old anecdote about Milton Friedman, right? He was at some place and they're like, oh, look at this public work, and look at how everybody using shovels instead of using, backhoes, which we have backhoes, but we're going to using shovels so we can employ more people. And Friedman kind of smiles and chuckles and says, well, if you want to employ more people, why not have them dig with spoons? That's what we're doing here. Yay, government efforts. Next section, maintaining wage rates. Throughout 1931, prices continued to fall. And yet wages were held relatively steady. Unemployment was going up, so people were losing their jobs, but in general, wage rates were held pretty steady. There were people who were saying, man, we've really held on to these wages of prosperity for a long time, much longer than we have in any other depression that went away after a year and 6 months. There was an economist named Oakwood who notes that prices and costs are not independent of each other. They actually are related to each other. And if prices fall, like prices of finished goods fall, then you must also have falling costs, or else businesses are going to fail. And wages are a big part of the cost of production of most goods. Therefore, you're going to end up with a bunch of companies that are basically overextended by having all this money thrown into wages, while prices of the things that they're creating are actually falling. Wage rates finally begin to start to fall in autumn of 1931. U.S. Steel dropped its wage rates, and they were attacked for violating their 1929 pledge. Whatever good a pledge by a hostage is worth. And then Rothbard notes that even Ford Motor Company was forced to drop wages in 1932, which is a little bit outside the scope of this chapter, but within the subject matter. Very short section on immigration restrictions. The only really key point here is that Hoover was urging Congress to curb immigration, and there failed to be any significant effort or result from Congress on that front. Next section is called voluntary relief. So here's the deal. Everybody was, well, at least Hoover and a lot of people around Hoover were like, the federal government is not going to do direct public relief, right? This had been a tenet of the federal government for a long, long time. There was a famous hurricane or something that knocked out a bunch of farmers in the South, and there was a bill in Congress, and people spoke out against it, saying, if we're going to start giving these farmers random money from the federal coffers, where does it end? And why not give it to everybody, kind of thing. It's a hole with no bottom. It's a giant moral hazard. Unfortunately, after nearly 3 years of this nonsense, Hoover, or not nonsense, but resistance, Hoover is now starting to hear in the side of his head, in his ear, all of his advisors saying, we need to do public relief, we need to do public relief. Hoover is starting to waver on this principle. He abolishes the Emergency Committee for Employment, bye-bye Bernays, and replaces it with something called the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief. And the question I ask here is, was he just trying to make sure that he got the credit if the thing worked out? It is 1931. It's getting very close to an election year, and this kind of reeks to me. What is this President's Organization going to do that Bernays' buddies can't do? There were more dumb attacks by Hoover on short selling. If there's a way to profit, like if you can conceive a way to profit off of a business failing, then that's better than the business just failing and everybody losing everything. But no, it's a common enemy. It happened during the Great Recession as well. There were more conferences called by Hoover. One in particular was on home building and home ownership. Hoover continues to ignore advice that's basically saying, dude, we need to let liquidation happen. Bad businesses have to go out of business so that their capital goods can be picked up by other businesses and put to productive use. And Hoover's like, no, not yet. He organized the formation of a new government lending agency, which Rothbard calls quasi-voluntary, which says a lot about how they were getting that money. He bullied a bunch of banks and insurance companies into supporting this organization. He convinced a lot of banks to put basically effectively a moratorium on mortgage foreclosures for farms, so long as the farmer was like being productive, kind of thing. Let me see if I can find the actual quote because it's a little bit goofy. Quasi-voluntary. Unless the debtor wanted to leave his farm. So even worse than I just said. Yeah. They were like, don't foreclose unless the debtor wants to leave, which is like crazy talk because, that would imply that the debtor has something even better on hand to try out. And so, really you shouldn't be coddling those debtors, but who knows? The federal government continued to throw a bunch of money at foundering banks. These banks are like just on the tip of failure, and the government keeps bailing them out. Sounds familiar again. There were more loans and more propping up in another conference late in the year. By December 21st, there was a very strange result, which was the Presidential Committee on Public Works, Not the same one as the President's Organization on Unemployment Relief. No, you can tell that all these government think tanks are multiplying like rats in a grain ship. But we got the Presidential Committee on Public Works, which surprisingly, to Rothbard and me, condemns public works, demands a balanced budget, and a readjustment of the economy to deal with the actual situation rather than hoping that all these malinvestments can be worked over in time. And that kind of covers 1931 as far as it goes. However, Rothbard does have one more section in the chapter that instead of talking about Hoover and his actions and the actions of the federal government, it's called The Spread of Collectivist Ideas in the Business World. And it's about how the socialist strain was starting to find, what's the word? What's the word for someone who find homes in people in the business world, especially the big businessmen who, can demand extra handouts. Swope, the guy from General Electric, came up with a gigantic plan, and it was really the precursor to the National Recovery Administration under Roosevelt, but it didn't quite it didn't quite come into effect while 1931. But basically, state chambers of commerce were all like, ooh, this SWOPE plan sounds great. We need more planning, more planning, more planning. We need councils, and we need to coordinate production and consumption, etc. And all this coordination, of course, is meant, by some dude who sits in a chair all day and doesn't actually work any of this stuff. It's all top-down, central planning nonsense, just like the USSR had tried and failed in the previous decade, which we'll get back to that in a second. There was pushes for intelligently planned business structures, which whenever you hear intelligently planned, you mean planned by these particular technocrats and all the other companies, all the companies that are trying to figure out how to do things on their own, basically get under fascist control by some government body. And there was even a statement. Let's see if I can figure out who the actual statement was from. Here we go. Henry I. Harriman of the New England Power Company wrote in his report, I'm going to cut some of this, but any dissenting businesses would be treated like any maverick. They'll be roped and branded and made to run with the herd. Goodbye individual liberty, right? And so that was kind of the push that was going on at the state level and at the business level. There was a lot of socialist infiltration of business. There's a huge list of names and calls for more central planning over in this section. So we're talking, page 277 through 284 in this issue, or in this edition. Rothbard notes that the dean of Harvard School of Business, Wallace B. Donham, was citing the USSR as a what do you call it? Like a shining example of good planning. Now, it's worth noting that the real socialist planning efforts in the USSR had already been tried and failed. The new economic policy, I believe is what it was called, was abandoned in 1928. So this was long after they were like, socialist planning doesn't freaking work even in the USSR. We can't do it here. This guy at freaking Harvard Business School is saying, oh yeah, we need to do what the USSR was doing, and that failed and caused, tons and tons of death and poverty. We have a guy named Bernard Baruch who suggests something that he called a Supreme Court of Industry. That basically, it's kind of the first shadows of what we call stakeholder capitalism these days. Hoover, thank goodness, resisted the SWOPE plan, and he resisted other collectivization plans, at least for now. However, what Rothbard observes is that his rhetoric changes. He ends up with a lot more references to things like cooperation and elimination of waste and other similar socialist buzzwords that don't mean anything other than more government control. The AFL, American Federation of Labor, had an emergency unemployment program in October, which what they said they would do is they would give industries, quote, quotas of jobs, end of quotation, to fill. As if somebody saying, well, you seem like you can create 1,000 jobs this month, so you're just going to have to do that, is going to help anything. There was more PR for people to stay in school to avoid hiring the wives of men who already have jobs, for instance. A lot of stuff like that. What ended up another really bad thing that happened was state cartelization of oil industries, what actually happened here, and I'm going to maybe read this for you real quick, because this is crazy stuff. Laws were enacted to conserve, quote-unquote, oil, but basically what they ended up doing is creating a compulsory monopoly or cartel in certain states of the oil industry. The lead was taken, I'm quoting now, the lead was taken by Oklahoma's Governor Alfalfa Bill Murray, like to see him in Groundhog Day, who ordered a general shutdown of the crude oil industry until the price of oil should rise to the, quote, minimum fair price of $1 a barrel, end quote, or end quote after minimum fair price. When some producers proved recalcitrant, Murray sent the Oklahoma National Guard into the oil fields to enforce his decree with bayonets. Soon, Texas followed suit, and then California, Texas, Kansas, and Oklahoma passed conservation and proration laws, laws to fix production ceilings in an orderly manner. Now, it's worth noting, and at the same time, there was the institution of oil tariffs. And of course, if you're worried about conservation, if that's your actual motivation, you don't want to stop imports. You just want to conserve local oil. So this justification was transparently a lie. They were not trying to conserve oil; they were just trying to reduce production. Oh, because why would you want to increase production while you're in a decreasing production depression situation? Congratulations, that's government thinking. Another thing that happened that's also of note, although less terrifying than Oklahoma sending the National Guard to oil wells, is that Hoover canceled a bunch of drilling permits on federal land at the same time. So, again, hit after hit after hit. We're in the middle of this friggin' depression. Everything's getting worse. People need employment, and the government is saying, you can't employ people this way, you can't employ people that way, you can't employ people this way. And they're just doing it because of nonsensical, pro-government ideas that have slipped into government and caused them to believe that they need to be the solution to every problem. What all this did, Rothbard says, is it basically set the stage for the Hoover New Deal in 1932. Yeah, so, Hoover kind of is resisting socialization. He's resisting this kind of, government control of industry, this kind of fascistic urge. Mussolini is actually mentioned once in the chapter. That someone says, "Well, we need a real Mussolini," and it's like, please stop. But that's how things were as of the end of 1931. So that will do it for this episode. Once again, America's Great Depression by Murray Rothbard. I'm reading the 5th edition, the hardcover published by Mises. Next up is Chapter 11, which is, I believe it's called The Hoover New Deal of 1932. And, the wheels are off. All of the attempts to paper over the Depression have failed. Unemployment is way high. Prices are dropping. Production is dropping. Consumption is holding better than production is, although it's still falling as well, simply by the fact that you can't keep consuming when production is down so far. And, now we have the socialists coming in and saying, oh, we have a solution to this problem, and as we will know, it is not the right solution to this problem. But that's it. There we go. Chapter 10. I will get on to Chapter 11. We'll finish up. We'll do that next week, I think. Actually, let me take a quick glance here. Chapter 11, we're almost done. So, let me take my... that's how much thickness of the book is left. And that's how much we've gone through. We're on page 284 of 3-something. And there's an appendix and a bibliography and stuff at the end. So, this is a hefty one. Okay, chapter 11 is probably going to be a two-parter. Because it goes from page 285 through 320. So we're talking 35 pages, and probably we're going to want to spend some time on it. Then after that, we've got chapter 12, which goes from page 321 through 337. So that's going to be a short one as well. But yeah, we're gonna probably take 11 in two parts so that we can properly enjoy learning about the Hoover New Deal. But it looks like we're going to be finishing this book up in the next 3 weeks, which is pretty surprising to me. I felt like this was going to go longer than it actually did. But as always, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope this was informative. I hope you found it interesting. If you have any comments or thoughts, please feel free to leave a comment. It would always help if you like and subscribe. If you've gotten this far, maybe you're finding some value in what I'm doing. And if you want, this chapter's references were a pain in the you-know-what, because about half of them were stuff that Rothbard's already referred to before. And then the other half of them were like these not obscure, but like ancient journals that you just can't find anywhere. He has like 3 references to barons from the friggin' 1930s, and like Barron's online archive goes back to 1997. So like I couldn't even find anybody who's like, yeah, we have the Baron, we at least have listings for the Barron's issues from the 1930s. Just nothing. So I got all the links to references that I could. They're going to be on the blog post, link in the description. And there's also a link to my show notes in that blog post as well. And so hopefully, if you want to follow up on any of Rothbard's references, you'll be able to do that for most of them. But some of them were just impossible to even find on like Google Scholar. It was crazy. I couldn't even find citations for some of them. Blew my mind. More difficult than I've seen through the entire book so far. Just like, it's on some microfiche somewhere in a dusty building somewhere, under a paperweight. God knows what. Anyway, as many references as I could get are going to be over on the blog post, including links. A lot of those are going to be paywalled, but, first steps, right? Just got to kind of get as much as we can. So we'll call it here for today. Once again, I appreciate you sticking around, and see you later, and have a good week.